welcome to the Washington Times Forum. I understand that Ambassador Kirkpatrick, otherwise detained, will be here in a few minutes. I'd just like to start by saying that the recent vote in the House of Representatives against any further aid to the Nicaraguan resistance drove home the Vietnam legacy with dramatic impact. Daniel Ortega's sudden departure for Moscow to seek some $200 million worth of assistance reminded me that between January 27, 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords on Vietnam were signed, and April 29, 1975, when Saigon finally fell to the communists, our own Congress cut military aid to our South Vietnamese ally by 76%. During that same period, the Soviet Union doubled its military aid to its North Vietnamese ally. And I believe that is the real parallel between Vietnam and the Soviet-Cuban enterprise in Nicaragua. Alfonso Robelo was one of the original members of the Sandinista junta, who defected when he saw that the revolution had been hijacked by a tiny minority of Marxists who were in the process of establishing a Leninist dictatorship more draconian than the one they had overthrown. Robelo, as some of you may have seen, said yesterday that at the core of congressional opposition to the aid was a moral and intellectual assumption that evidently still guides American liberalism. Namely, communists would become Democrats if only they were more generously treated. This still remains, he said, the conviction of the Vietnam generation, leaders such as Congressman Michael Barnes and Jim Leach and Senators John Kerry and Tom Harkin. They are confident that they possess a unique sophistication and moral authority that, if only given its way, can win over the Sandinista comandantes. It is a conviction I know well, too well. It has cost me, said Robelo, 5 years of bitter disappointment and 2 attempts on my life to learn how profoundly untrue it is. Secretary Schultz implored America last Thursday to shake free from the shackles of self-doubt from the Vietnam era and recommit to resisting communism, beginning in Nicaragua. Schultz added that many who bitterly oppose the Vietnam War have a more sober assessment now of the price that was paid for failure. And many of those who supported the war, and I am one of them, now have a more sober understanding of the responsibilities that rest on our nation's leaders when they call on Americans to make such a sacrifice. We now have 535 hands on our foreign policy steering wheel. The President's ability to carry out his principal responsibilities, namely national and international security, has been seriously undermined. It is imperative that Congress and the administration craft a new bipartisan policy to fill the growing vacuum, lest President Reagan's defeat be interpreted as consent for the spread of Marxism in this hemisphere. It was to try to restore some balance to daily journalism that I accepted the responsibility of editor-in-chief of the Washington Times. And the Times has gathered this distinguished panel here today to try to determine whether bipartisanship can be restored to our foreign policy and whether America can continue to play its traditional countervailing role for free peoples everywhere and thus give hope to those who still suffer under the dark forces of totalitarianism. Bismarck once said that history is simply a piece of paper covered with print. The main thing is still to make history, not to write it. History is neutral, to be shaped by political and military leaders, not media stars and public opinion pollsters, which seems to be increasingly our new form of government. And now to introduce our panel, I give you Harry G. Summers, whose much acclaimed book titled On Strategy was a critical analysis of the Vietnam War and has become and will remain a classic. Colonel Summers is on the staff of the Strategic Studies Institute of the Army War College, following a very long, distinguished military and academic career. Colonel Summers.
I'll go over there and talk and see how you can leave this up.
Recently, going out to speak on college campuses and speaking out at various symposiums on the Vietnam War, I'm more and more impressed that the real enemy we face is not the Vietnam syndrome. The real enemy we face is ignorance. And probably the most pernicious thing that's happened to us in the last few years is not the loss of the Vietnam War so much as the advent of the teaching of social sciences in our schools. And when we find in the press the other day that 93% of the children in primary grades cannot locate Vietnam on the map, and that same group, most of them locate the United States where Brazil actually is, we're in big trouble. I thought of how to introduce this most distinguished panel, and I came to me a conversation I had at the height of the Vietnam War when I was teaching at the Staff College of Leavenworth. I'm talking to a high school teacher who was very much against the war, and I said to him, well, if you feel that strongly about it, why don't you write to your congressman? He said, well, what good would that do? And I said, well, the congressman could cut off all funds for the war, and the war would end tomorrow. He said, well, that wouldn't do any good. The president would just spend his own money. I said, wait a minute. The president doesn't have one red cent that the Congress doesn't allocate for him. And he said, where'd you get a crazy idea like that at? And I said, well, in the Constitution of the United States in the first place. So we had people attempting to overthrow the system that didn't understand what the system was. And on our panel, two very distinguished gentlemen who knew what the system was and knew that the proper response to a policy you didn't agree with was in the political process and to challenge the political process. So it seems to me if we understand the nature of our democracy, if we understand, I was very disturbed the other day to see a line saying against Secretary Weinberger's remarks on the uses of power, well, the Bolsheviks wouldn't get to where they are today if they'd have done that. And the answer to that is precisely. And if we hadn't followed the democratic principles, we'd be exactly where the Bolsheviks are today. That is on the ash heap of history, with time running out. So that I think the corrective, if you will, for Vietnam is education, is understanding. And we certainly have a panel, most distinguished panel, able to advance a better understanding of where we've been, I hope, and where we're going. I don't think that biographical information is really necessary to introduce Ambassador Kirkpatrick, certainly well known, Senator McCarthy, Admiral Stockdale, Senator McGovern. I think that we'll have a very interesting panel here this morning, and let me just mention a little bit how the panel will be conducted. Each of the participants will give about a 5-minute introductory remarks. We'll go right through the panel in the order of the introduction, and then following these remarks, we'll open the panel up to questions, and I'll moderate then the questions as they come up. And with no further ado, Ambassador Kirkpatrick. You can use the podium if you like, or...
Okay, I'll use the podium if I may. I would like to begin by noting that
I think that's me, unfortunately.
I'd like to begin by noting that I had no official role whatsoever with regard to U.S. policy during the years from 1955, when President Eisenhower sent the first advisors to Vietnam, and 1975, when the last American left that country in disarray. I was very busy at that point in my own life, in the first decade having babies and taking care of them, and in the second decade teaching political science and reflecting about the world, but not really doing much. I was, to be sure, moderately active in some aspects of Democratic politics, Democratic Party politics, that is, and followed, of course, the war in newspapers, on television, and in books. Read a great deal about it and have reflected a good deal about it since. But I am, of all the people in this panel, certainly the one who had not only the least involvement, but the only one, I guess, who had really no involvement in either the conduct of the war or of the anti-war response. I have nonetheless, I have been active principally in thinking about the consequences of the war on American foreign policy, I take it that we could all agree that the United States almost surely should never have become involved in the Vietnam War, certainly in the fashion in which it did. I take it, that seems to me really, retrospectively, to be quite clear. It's a very long way away from us, on the other side of the world, quite literally. It seems to me, not clearly affected directly with a vital American national interest. I take it that our presence in Vietnam made sense as part of a global containment policy, and the resolve of progressive presidents, largely Democratic presidents, to pay any price and bear any burden, literally, to assist independent nations in not being subverted or overrun by groups using force to establish communist governments. I take it that the United States concluded that it was our responsibility to help South Vietnam resist being overtaken from the north, literally because we were acting in the spirit of the world's policeman. I've had quite a bit of opportunity to reflect on this concept of the world's policeman as I sat in the Security Council and reflected on that body, which was literally intended initially to provide the world after World War II with a global policeman. I was very struck by the comments of Brian Urquhart, who is the Deputy Secretary General, Undersecretary General of the United Nations, about the United Nations. In fact, I believe one has to go back to the Charter of the United Nations to understand how we ever arrived at that rather extraordinary concept of being the world's policeman. Urquhart wrote, and I would like to read this just very briefly, about the assumptions of the UN Charter. He said that the Charter describes a system for maintaining international peace and security, which assumes that all governments will play the roles assigned to them. Those involved in disputes will avail themselves of the means available in the Charter to settle disputes peacefully. If they fail to do this, the membership of the United Nations, under the guidance of the Security Council, will take a series of steps designed to persuade them to do so. The governments concerned will heed and obey the injunctions of the Security Council. And if, in the end, the threat to peace persists, the Council, led by its permanent members, will apply enforcement measures ranging from economic sanctions to military action to restore peace and security. This notion of taking military actions to restore peace and security after a threat to international peace had occurred through the use of aggression by some party is, I think, the guiding principle of the Charter of the United Nations. I think it's very interesting that President Truman, who articulated the Greek-Turkey doctrine and the containment doctrine, made clear that he also was operating from these assumptions of the Charter when, in the case of North Korean aggression to the south, he went to the United Nations to seek action to restrain North Korea. And we, of course, and other countries acted in Korea under the United Nations flag and in the name of the United Nations. And to this very day, we are present there under the United Nations flag. The Charter, I think, saw a world policeman as an attribute of peacekeeping. And peacekeeping was to be designed, of course, to contain aggressors or to repel aggressors. And I think that once the not only did the Cold War develop, but the instrumentalities of the United Nations were paralyzed effectively by the split within the world and the Soviet use of the veto. Then there wasn't any world policeman, but in fact we, the United States, went on acting as though it was an appropriate response for us to assume those responsibilities, if necessary, unilaterally. As I read much of the language in which Presidents Truman talked about this problem, and then Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and discussions of aggression across internationally recognized boundaries and so forth, it seems to me that this is the background of U.S. action and indeed the background of the very notion of a containment policy. But it also seems just as clear to me that under conditions of a paralyzed United Nations and Security Council and peacekeeping mechanisms for these purposes, it is really not workable for the United States to assume those responsibilities. If there's anything that I think is clear retrospectively, it is that. Colonel Gaddafi, who is no great friend of ours, asserted in a speech about a year ago that he would drive the United States to ruin by forcing us to fight 100 wars on 100 fronts. And he suggested Chad and Egypt and Sudan and Nicaragua and a good many other places. Now, it is perfectly clear that we would indeed destroy ourselves, as Colonel Gaddafi suspects, if we could be tricked into, seduced into, provoked into fighting 100 wars on 100 fronts. Obviously, in the post-Vietnam period particularly, we have good reason to reflect hard on the limits of our power and also on the limits of our national consistency and our altruism. I don't think we had, in fact, faced any of those very clearly. My own opinion is that if we face those limits of our power and our altruism and our national character, generally we would see that we should be extremely niggardly in the use of force. That the use of force, in my opinion, should be reserved for those instances where there is a fairly direct stake that fairly directly affects a vital national interest. But I would add to that that it also seems in the post-Vietnam period that we have a very unfortunate tendency to confuse power with force. And that in recoiling from the use of force, we have developed very unfortunate, dangerous inhibitions about the use of American power. Not force, but economic and technological and diplomatic and so forth. It is a fact that Soviet expansion continues, and it is a fact that independent nations are, to this day, being progressively incorporated into a Soviet empire and an expanding world socialist system that threatens vital sea lanes and strategic minerals and indeed our interests potentially on many fronts. It is a fact that the Soviet Union continually arms client states, and that we have arrived in the post-Vietnam period in a condition where we neither want to help others help themselves, nor to help them ourselves. I think that adequate reflection on the Vietnam experience would lead us to conclude that we could and should help others help themselves, that is realistic in its demands on our resources and our altruism, that it would reflect more respect for them, and and less opportunities for demoralization and denigration on their part. Finally, I think that the United States must be particularly careful today to avoid those twin dangers of isolation or war. I believe that nothing can more endanger the peace than American withdrawal from the international arena and the failure to use the instrumentalities of power, short of force, to protect the kind of world of independent nations which we need in order to live and thrive. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm not sure that I didn't need more introduction. I didn't used to it. I was crossing the street in New York about 3 months ago, and a man seemed to recognize me. I was pleased by that. And he said, "You're Senator McCarthy, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, just as a light change, "But you're not as much against the communists as you used to be." I said, "That's right." I said, "You know, the American press really keeps people up on things, and that to know." I am really not here to defend my position relative to the war in Vietnam. I rather laid the burden on history. But in the course of the last week or two, there have been at least 4 people who advocated that war, more or less, who have gone into print to words to lay the blame on others. Mr. Nixon in his book, and Henry Kissinger in the New York Times, and President Reagan, and the Secretary of State, Mr. Schultz. And taken all together, they say the real responsibility for failure there was the press. At least they contributed. The anti-war people are those who were critical of it. These primarily, and one of them even said that it sort of goes back to John Kennedy's inaugural address, which I thought was really rather refined historical judgment. And I would like to make the point that the war was really run for 10 years almost by the people who were for it. There was some marginal criticism around the edges, but it was not very effective. And the advocates of it, those who conducted, were given pretty much what they wanted. In the 50s, there was no serious complaint when Eisenhower sent in advisors, and I assume that if he had proceeded to send bombers to support the French, that would have been supported, at least in the short run. There was no serious protest when Kennedy sent in the 17 or 18,000. When President Johnson asked for the Tonkin Gulf resolution, it was almost unanimously supported in the Congress. And the argument for that was that we had to let the Vietnamese know that we were behind the president. It was almost unanimous. And as we progressed on through until 1970 or 71, 72, before there was any serious action on the part of Congress to cut down on the military support that the presidents had asked for. We didn't win in 68. I was rejected by the Democratic Party. We were trying to leave the burden of guilt on those who'd been for the war. They didn't want it. They said, let's spread it around. Senator McGovern ran in 72. He was rejected in 72. So to turn around and say, well, the responsibility for the way things have gone in Vietnam and in Southeastern Asia and now in Nicaragua is pushing it a little bit too hard, I think. As that war developed, I decided I was not going to know enough about it specifically to say, now I know where the lines are and where the rivers are and where you can put up a defensive line, but rather to begin to take a look at what the people who were running the war were saying. And I went on at the time of the Tonkin Gulf, I said, I had some doubts about it even before we held the hearings, that sailors on midnight watches see strange things. And the difference between a mermaid and a dolphin and a torpedo in that light is rather difficult to distinguish. But they evidently thought they had. In any case, we went along with it. But as we went on, I began to wonder whether Rusk and McNamara and others really knew as much about it as they seemed to. And I became suspicious of Rusk quite early in '65. I went on the Foreign Relations Committee. And President Johnson at that time was inviting 15 or 20 senators down to the White House for kind of nighttime briefings. And if you were a heavy cabinet member, you got 10 minutes. Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State. If you were a lesser cabinet member, you only got 5, and the president kept the watch on them. Rusk was considered heavy. And he explained to us that General Kahn had established a really solid government. I think it was Wednesday night, that this was stable. They put together all the factions, the Buddhists and the Catholics and the rest. I think it was Friday morning the paper carried the headline that Kahn had been thrown out. So here you had the Secretary of State with 2 days lead time on what was going to happen. But I'm sure he didn't deceive us intentionally. He didn't say, you know, I'm going to tell these guys tonight that it's stable and then know what's going to happen on Wednesday. But you would have assumed that the Secretary of State would have had some feeling of uncertainty about the administration of General Kahn roughly 2 days before it was to end. Well, that, I think, the most particular, very limited example of the sort of things that led me to believe that there was some lack of knowledge of what was going on politically. And the same thing happened relative to the military position. In the case of McNamara, I think he said he really thought the war was unwinnable in 1966. It would have been helpful if he had told us that. But that was the year in which he, as I recall, was going to have the boys home by Christmas time. Whether, of course, you could have lost and got them home earlier, but you wondered what his objective judgment was. And he testified with the bombing. Again, as I said, we didn't stop at the bombing, all of these things. The increase we argued against with General Gavin against putting in more than 100,000 men in '65, but that argument didn't prevail, and the number of troops rose, as you know, to 500,000. The bombing took place. Well, McNamara was testifying, and he said, with the bombing, the North Vietnamese would be able to infiltrate and supply up to 4,500 a month. And roughly 4 or 5 months later, the report was they were infiltrating and supplying 7,000 a month. And I asked the secretary to explain the difference. He said, what difference? I said, well, 4,500 and 7,000. I said, I assumed that 4,500 was a ceiling. And he said the number they could infiltrate has always been more than 4,500, but it's less than X. Well, you start looking around the room, you know, see if there's an exit or something. If the margin of error is somewhere between 4,500 and X, and he did say, in effect, that X was a determinable number, but it's not yet been determined. Well, you say infinity minus 1 could be X. I mean, so you got a range of error there that leads you not to ask him any more questions. And I resolved not to at that point. But a year later, I was tempted again. You're sort of playing these personality games. And Senator Morse, for some reason, said, how many tanks are there in Latin America? And McNamara said 974. And he didn't look it up. He didn't ask anybody. He couldn't have anticipated. He didn't say about 1,000. He said 974. And then he said, without another question, that's 60% as many tanks as a single country, Bulgaria, has. And even though I'd resolved not to ask him another question, I was stirred by this. Curious, and I did. I had to wait till the next day to ask him, and he finally got to me, and I said I was interested in that number of tanks in Latin America, 974, and he said, that's right. And I said, well, I believe it. But I said, why did you tell us it was 60% of the number in Bulgaria? He said, well, because it is. And I said, well, I believe that. But I said, why Bulgaria? I said, do you count tanks relative to Bulgaria? I said, is there a Bulgarian absolute? He said, if there were, I would tell you about it. And that's where we left it. Well, these are kind of peripheral things, but the fact is we were looking at the people who were running it and asking questions as though you were a student of history, and you were like 50 years after. And in a way, I think this is the nature of this war. It lasted some 30 years, and if you were in politics or in the military, you could judge it in some kind of historical context, because 30 years is a pretty good piece of history, and you could see it developing, and you could see what was happening, and you sort of saw how it was resolved. In any case, we tried by various ways to discourage the president from, with the support of people like Gavin, not to go beyond 100, 150,000 men. We objected to the bombing. We suggested negotiations, and none of these things happened. And in '68, I thought, well, the only thing to do is to ask for a public judgment on it, and at least within the Democratic Party. And I think what happened in that year, and still going on in a way, is sort of the convention in Chicago really involved a sort of a transfer of responsibility, because there'd been no political party or political body. The country had not accepted responsibility for the war. It was pretty much a post-64 escalation. And what happened at the convention was that those who had supported the war were responsible for it in a personal way, put the responsibility for it on the Democratic Party. And the party accepted it, and accepting that much guilt and responsibility made them rather resentful. And I think it ran on through that, and what's involved in some of the discussion of Vietnam now is still the question of guilt and responsibility. I've, with little success, proposed to the Democrats that I would publicly say I was sorry I was right if they would forgive me, but they won't. I mean, that's the worst thing you can do in politics, probably in the military, is be right and not win. And so that's sort of where we are. And if I could just make one note, sort of following from what Ambassador Kirkpatrick said, is that I think it's highly important that it would have been in Vietnam, and it should be now, that we make our judgments, especially with reference to war, in the best kind of historical context in which we can make them, not in the range of some ideological commitment, which to a large extent was involved in Vietnam, when you had principally the work of John Foster Dulles, who set up the idea of ideological conflict every place in the world. If you could establish a communist position on one side, we didn't have to really ask any questions about our right or maybe even our duty to go in. The only question you had then was whether or not you had the military or technical or other power to deal with it. So it became almost like the religious wars of the 17th and 18th century. The ideological position was established, the military followed, and I'm told that the Pentagon had a contingency plan for every possible political conflict, and I'm told that every contingency plan always ends in victory. And so we ought to back off and say, let's judge it in historical context, our interest, the potential for good. And if you had done that with Vietnam, I think anyone would have said, if we're going to get involved with communists, and you allowed them to pick the place, they would have said Vietnam. Distance, geography, willingness to fight, backed up against two countries which could supply them. And that's what they would have said, and that is where we were. So we'd all just back off, I guess, and be historians. And if you need some reading on the matter, there was a book by a man named Laterguy written about the French involvement. It was a novel in Vietnam and Algeria. But he had, as a frontispiece, which I read early, and I had doubts about the war from that time on, it was a letter from a member of the Augustan Legion in Africa at the beginning of our era. And he wrote back and he said, we Roman soldiers are willing to die for the honor of Rome and what Rome was, but we understand that this war is not supported in Rome, that nobody cares. And he said, if that's the case, he said, beware of the centurions when we return.
Well, Senator, you just introduced the centurion who returned. I will be quite different in my viewpoint, my vantage point of this thing, because I will say that I kind of look at it from the existentialist viewpoint. I'm a philosophy professor, you know, Tom. Now, somebody described to me, a wiser man than I, that the existentialist viewpoint can be demonstrated, say, in a football stadium where the ambassador and senators look at life from the stands. They see the plays and they see where mistakes were made, and the whole scheme is laid out there before them. The world sort of performs for them. Now the existentialist sees the same game but from a different viewpoint. He's the nose guard. And he's down there, and you get different perceptions. And I think either viewpoint has validity. And so I was, as may not be necessary to say, involved for 10 years in Vietnam. 63 as a fighter pilot, 64 as a fighter pilot, 65 as a wing commander, shot down, and the rest of the 10 years in Hanoi. And I didn't go into this thing with naivety. There was lots of idealism available in this conflict. I think all of us kind of coasted along, trying to save the Vietnamese people from, South Vietnamese people, from communism. Noble cause was the name of this meeting. Of course, it was noble, resist aggression. We know that was a planned operation now with General Giap's admission that it was policy since '59, oppose tyranny, and there's no question about the tyrannicalness of the North Vietnamese, I don't believe now. But it would seem that we in America have just enough idealism to want to get out there in harm's way and not enough commitment to carry it off. And a lot of smart people knew that in 1962, and even though some of us it takes longer to learn, and many of those smart people gravitated to government where the power was. And the frustration of this problem with American idealism and yet lack of commitment had apparently driven them into a kind of a cynical mindset even before we got the project off the ground. And there is a way to do it, maybe Mr. McNamara said. I don't know who did, but they wanted to keep uncontrollable variables out of the mix, like the howling mobs, the people. Harry Summers does wonders with this idea. And so we started stuff on the QT. Of course, you know about the Tonkin Gulf and my seat there. LBJ was elated, we read. Sometimes he said those sailors were shooting at whales, sometimes flying fish. But he was, we'll never know. McGeorge Bundy, one of the quotes I have, says, "I know this sounds odd, but when LBJ got the Tonkin Gulf resolution, he thought he'd won the war." Being so fond of the power of Congress, or so well acquainted with it, you were entitled to ask me, I suppose, weren't you concerned with this duplicity in high places? You might ask me, and I have to assume that I was at least as aware of all of this going on as the gentleman over here on my left, Senators McCarthy and McGovern. At least I knew more than they did when they voted for the Tonkin Gulf resolution. And I would say yes, but the thing that concerned me in all of this was mainly the effect this duplicity would have on the eventual confidence the government had in itself. And I started worrying about, and I think correctly, as I've written in recently, tormented, sensitive men who, when the going gets tough, are going to head for the ditch and leave the rest of us holding the bag. Starting into a war is like heading west in a wagon train, because you're going to have many times up the road when you're going to want to turn back, and the last thing you want is a skittish trail boss. And you don't want a trail boss whose purposes are devious either. Now let's take it to January '65, very early. I'm reading now about things I didn't realize then, but at that time I was working up an air group to take it back out there to really get this job done of saving South Vietnam. And now I see an argument constructed by McNaughton for McNamara to sell LBJ on a bombing package that I was going to execute months later, a few months later, in which he attempted to put down as a matter of convincing the president he should. What is this? What are we in this war for? And I see that 20% he listed was keeping China from acquiring new territory, which in historical hindsight, that was bunk. 70% preventing humiliation and saving the North Vietnamese people, at least in the minds of those in power in 1965 January, was 10%. I hate to keep talking names, but I don't think Ralph Waldo Emerson was ever more correct for this period when he said, there is no history, only biography, and there's no way you can look at America's involvement in Vietnam and see anything like a historic process. It's just a series of very, very bright, peculiar people. Well, things looked bad when I left, that is when I eventually got where I was going, Hanoi, by September 1965. But there I found out it was worse. I'm not talking about physical situations, but from an international standpoint. Now, I don't consider myself a victim. I think that's pretty clear. In fact, I wouldn't take anything for these experiences. I really saw a chunk of history that very few are privileged to see. Now, I have to look at the Vietnam War from where I saw most of it, Hanoi. How could I know, a poor shackled POW so far from where the action was? Well, in the first place, Hanoi was where the action was. The DRV was reacting, that animate object that reacts, around which, according to Clausewitz, we should have directed our will. And that's the first thing I would say, is that it was clear to me that that's where it was all going to happen. There was I was shackled, but I had a window to the world, sometimes cloudy, opaque one, but just as often brilliantly illuminating. Constant interrogations. I was the senior officer for most of this time. And I was also a kind of guilty of being a little too attractive to these constant interrogations. It's a trade-off. But I was, as you'll see, talking daily in various postures, sometimes in anger, with a very bright young officer. I was able to tell him, to give you an idea, and he was the only man that I ever bragged about being a member of the Communist Party, and we talked about that, and he gave me the criteria and so forth, but he would give me these, and I would say, that's not what Lenin said, you are a deviationist. And he would listen, and he was bright. But I had my secret weapon was that 3 years before I was shot down, I just left 24 months of graduate school in political science and philosophy at Stanford, and had done a lot of work in comparative Marxist thought. The commissar of the whole camp system was my main antagonist, a man my age, and I'm talking about a man in his 40s, who sat on the general staff. Now, we didn't leak secrets to me, and I didn't leak secrets to him. We were in deadlock combat. But you cannot spend the thousands of hours with those people without picking up a lot of stuff. One night it was, and I write about this in our book, my chore as the duty intellectual American to go and have his mind picked by a man named Nguyen Ngoc Vien. Nguyen Ngoc Vien is, I think, either number 3 or number 4 man in North Vietnam's government right now. That time he was known as the world's greatest propagandist. He writes English in a more convincing fashion than any other Vietnamese, I think. He was a medical doctor, spent most of his life in Paris. That night, there was no hassle. My first trip off crutches, had been shot down at six months. A rainy night, blindfolded, handcuffed, taken down to a place that turned out to be an old French government building, and led up a flight of stairs, which I could barely negotiate, and into this room full of officers, obviously senior generals, probably no insignia, all facing a man in civilian clothes at the other end of the couch. I won't give you the whole thing, but we had quite a talk. He went with a Western orientation. It's hard to disguise that. Where are you, a Catholic or you're Protestant? You know, philosophy 1, which direction, what drives you, authority or conscience? And, you know, this is old-fashioned kind of stuff. But there he was, and he was trying to take me down the track of the German army and my failure to meet the threat of a tyrant, which I, of course, left off. But he says, our country has no capability to defeat you on the battlefield, but war is not decided by weapons so much as by national will. Once the American people understand this war, they will have no interest in pursuing it. They will be made to understand this, and we will win this war on the streets of New York. That's February 1966, about the time some of our friends were starting to split off. Learn, learn, learn. Always we took the middle way. Even the McNamara note was a compromise solution. And you could see there, I was haunted all the time I was there by this gathering storm quote of Churchill's that talked about the conflict of idealism and restraint and leading to the bullseye of disaster. Never any commitment. They knew we had no commitment. They could see we were on the fence, and they were rather whimsical, kind of, I mean, they really got our number quickly. There's very little interest in the National Front of Liberation, as we saw why later. First bombs in Hanoi, aren't, enraged. Don't you Americans understand the Chinese threat? No, I had a wise crack at that, and they kicked me out. The B-52 bombings taught me a lot, and I think a lot of Americans ought to realize that we are paranoid about bombing. Bombing is a very effective weapon, mainly for shock effect, and it will save a lot of lives. We could have saved 58,000 lives of that raid had it run in 1964 with no threat from China. So I got to get off this podium. In other words, to paraphrase Churchill, it is my purpose as one who lived and acted in those days to show how the malice of the wicked was reinforced by the weakness of the virtuous, how the counsels of prudence and restraint became the prime agents of mortal danger, and how the middle course, adopted from desires to appease the opposition, led direct to the bullseye of disaster.
I'm not quite sure how 3 5-minute speeches got us to 11:15, but it's kind of like the Vietnam experience. We started off with a limited commitment until it almost became a total engagement. In any event, it has impressed me as I've listened to my colleagues here today that either inadvertently or by design, the Washington Times has called on 4 professors to dissect what happened in Vietnam, all of whom have rather vigorous views. And this calls to mind Walter Lippmann's lament that there's nothing quite so dangerous as a belligerent professor. But we at least have preserved some degree of scholarly objectivity here today, in that we've represented a variety of viewpoints. We don't all follow the same assumptions. I was especially impressed with Senator McCarthy's observation that one of the central lessons of Vietnam, and I think it applies equally to Nicaragua, is that one should know something about the historical factors rather than relying too heavily on ideological assumptions as a guide for public policy. I remember back during the Vietnam debate days when Senator McCarthy was in the thick of that fight and others were participating, that it was difficult to find any theme that you could enunciate on which there was any consensus at all between hawks and doves, as they were then called. But one theme that came close to that was to say we should either get in or get out. I noticed when some speaker would say that, you would find both critics of the war and those who were supporting it nodding at least partial assent. If the war is worth fighting, let's get in with the kind of commitment that it takes to resolve it. If it's not, let's get out. Now, the only modifier I would add to that, and it's an extremely important one in my judgment, is that if you opt for the first alternative of getting in, you should be absolutely sure that it's a case that's well worth that kind of commitment. Don't get involved in ambivalent conflicts, because while the policymakers may think it's a limited commitment, to the person who dies on the battlefront, it's a total commitment. And this, I think, was the great mistake in Vietnam, that we entered a rather ambivalent situation where it was difficult really to know where the American interest lay. But in some effort to bring the perspective of history on that, maybe we could just take a couple of minutes to look back on how this happened. I have no doubt that the basic assumption that took us into Vietnam was the anti-communist ideology that has guided American foreign policy during most of the period since World War II. But if you go back to those early days after World War II, you had a situation where the French, for 100 years, had maintained a rather unpopular colony, French Indochina, which they temporarily lost to the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. And it was during that period, I think, that I first heard about Ho Chi Minh. Not very much, but I became aware of the fact that there was something of an underground out there operating against the Japanese. And I then learned after the war that Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of that movement, and during that period was on our side against the Japanese, some of my fellow pilots owe their lives to Ho Chi Minh's underground, that he began to contact the United States government about the possibility of helping him prevent the French from going back in after the war was over. That was a view that was not entirely rejected by Franklin Roosevelt when he was in the White House. At one time, he wrote a memorandum saying the French have milked that area for 100 years. The people of Indochina deserve something better than that. And he had in mind, apparently, some kind of a UN trusteeship that would have prepared that area for independence. President Truman, coming into office without that background and historical perspective, was more interested in getting the French involved in the Western Alliance system. And he rejected some 11 or 12 letters from Ho Chi Minh asking for American support against the French. And we took a different view. We began gradually to finance the 8-year-old French war effort out there, until by the time it ended in defeat in 1954, we were financing about 80% of the cost of that war effort. I think that was a mistake in terms of the American interest. All of us might have wished that Ho Chi Minh had been a Jeffersonian Democrat, but the fact that he was a Marxist didn't necessarily mean that we had a serious obligation in terms of our national interest in helping him, in preventing him from keeping the French from their reestablishment of their colonies in Southeast Asia. And I think the better part of wisdom in that circumstance would have been to have remained neutral and not to have become involved in that losing French enterprise, which itself was attempting to combat one of the most fundamental forces in that part of the world, the force of nationalism. The second big mistake, it seems to me, came over our failure to back the elections. Where we had a second chance to make an American decision. Following the French defeat, the peace terms called for elections 2 years later on July 20th, 1956. During that period, President Eisenhower told his colleagues that in a legitimate election, Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote in both South Vietnam and North Vietnam, neither one of which were recognized as independent countries by us. But in any event, again, I think on the grounds of ideology, we came down on the side of opposing those elections and did what we could to encourage a different kind of government to come to power in South Vietnam, and one not committed to elections. I think here again, we missed an opportunity for a resolution of this problem that would have been far more satisfactory than the one we now have. And if indeed we believe in the concept of self-determination, and President Eisenhower was right that 80% of the people out there were behind Ho Chi Minh, one has to wonder how we square subsequent American policy with all of that. I think we took a much more intelligent course in other areas. For example, with Yugoslavia, I don't know how to assess which was the stronger communist, Marshal Tito or Ho Chi Minh. But in any event, with reference to Yugoslavia, notwithstanding the fact they were on the Soviet border, we assumed in this instance that through intelligent diplomacy and trade and even some limited assistance, that while we couldn't accomplish what the editor-in-chief referred here to earlier, converting them to freedom, we might at least work out a relationship with them that would not be inimical to the interests of the United States. I think that opportunity was open to us in Vietnam, even if one assumes the eventual triumph of Ho Chi Minh. What is the evidence that his victory, without the American involvement, without our long support of the French, would have created more damaging circumstances than the one we now have? It's quite possible, one can't be certain of this, that what would have emerged is a kind of a Tito situation, a communist regime, to be sure, but one that we could have lived with far less pain and sacrifice and division and weakening of our own country than the course we eventually chose. These are the kind of considerations that make me concerned about the current proposals, that it's all right for us to assist the Contras in Nicaragua. I recognize that one can't always draw exact parallels. Obviously, there are great differences between Nicaragua and the situation that confronted us in Vietnam, but you do have the same ambivalence. You do have the same unclear case as to whether it's in the American interest to become deeply involved in this Nicaraguan conflict. I think it's a legitimate objective of American policymakers to try to limit the influence of the Soviet Union in Latin America, to influence try to influence events so that we reduce Cuba's power in those areas. But if one looks at some of the lessons of Vietnam, it's clear to me that whereas our policymakers thought for many years that the best way to check possible Chinese penetration of Southeast Asia was by defeating Ho Chi Minh, the evidence is that there never was any love lost between these two powers, and that in terms of America's security and our national interest, we might have had a more dependable ally against possible Chinese penetration into Southeast Asia, which I take it was one of the reasons we were in Vietnam, if we had cooperated with Ho Chi Minh rather than investing all these tens of thousands of lives and billions of dollars and all the division here at home trying to defeat this essentially nationalist Vietnamese leader. I think the same thing is true in Nicaragua. It's a legitimate objective to try to limit Soviet influence in Nicaragua, but I would suggest that we might be better advised in achieving that objective if we cooperated with the government of Nicaragua, which incidentally we recognize. We do have an embassy there, But instead of concentrating American policy on sabotaging that government, concentrate on trying to use the former Somoza forces and some of those disillusioned with the present government to overthrow it, we'd be far better advised in reducing Soviet influence in Nicaragua and advancing our own if we were to concentrate on a diplomatic and economic effort to cooperate with this government rather than sabotaging it. And I'd say in all due respects to the editor-in-chief who launched this discussion today, this is not an effort to convert the Sandinistas into Thomas Jefferson Democrats. It's a recognition that we're probably not likely to do that with either side. And under these conditions of ambivalence and ambiguity, I think it's in our national interest to stand largely clear of any military involvement there and to do what we can, recognizing the difficulties, to draw that Nicaraguan government into a more rational relationship with the rest of the hemisphere. This is the purpose of the Contadora process. It's the process that I think we ought to be backing, and the one that, in my judgment, builds on the lessons of Vietnam.
Two of the three, you know, the principles of war asks three principal questions. What are we trying to do? How are we going to do it? And who's going to command it? It seems to me, at least today, in the panel, we've got consensus that the first principle of war, the principle of the objective, is still with us, because I think that one theme runs through the comments of every one of our panelists, how critical it is to know exactly what we're trying to do. And while we may disagree over what exactly we're trying to do, that one question must be answered for anything that we do to make any sense whatsoever. With those short comments, I'd like to open it up to questions now. Please keep your questions brief. We're running a little bit over time, and to give as many people as possible a chance to have something to say. Please.
Senator McGovern and Senator McCarthy, it's been a long time to have an opportunity to say something to you. In Vietnam, when we were fighting, you were urging the college campuses to uprise against our government, the same government we were fighting for. Don't you have any guilt?
Well, actually, we didn't urge them to uprise. They were rising up before I got into the campaign of '68. We urged them to go into political action, which is what they did. It's quite a proper thing to do. It was not uprising. It was a challenge to a national policy, and we were challenging it within the political process, which is where it should have been.
Senator McGovern.
I have one sense of guilt, and that is that I didn't speak out stronger earlier in the war. I think it was such a dreadful disaster and such an incredible blunder of American policy that I wish I had spoken out with even greater force at an earlier time. I did raise some questions about it as early as 1963, the first year that I came to Congress. But after the death of President Kennedy and President Johnson's pledge that he would not send American forces into Vietnam, as he put it, we're not sending American boys to do the job that Asian boys ought to be doing. I lapsed into silence for a critical year during '64 and early '65. I think that was a mistake. It was a mistake partly because we didn't really keep faith with the young men that we sent out to Vietnam. I went out there rather early in '65. I found a great many of them that already had serious questions about it. I think that the proper role of a patriot at that time was to just go all out to stop that war. The test of patriotism is not to accept public policy, but to try to change it when you think it's against the national interest. The true patriot is always going to try to call the country to a higher standard, and I just regret that that process was so slow in coming in Vietnam.
General Murray?
The question of being conscience-stricken, I think it's an important one. And something that Senator McGovern said about citing Senator McCarthy's comments leads me to a different aspect, and that is blame. The people that were running the war at that time, as the senator pointed out, were to blame, and that includes the military and its generalship, of which I can fault myself. But let me ask you this question. When, on a questionnaire to the combat generals, they said that they were exaggerating the body count for the benefit of their own unit performance. They also did not believe in Westmoreland's search and destroy tactics. Now I ask you, what kind of generalship can you have? How can you win a war when you've got generals who are lying about it and not believing it? What about institutional integrity? What about duty, honor, country? That's what disturbs me.
I think you're exactly right. To return to my original comment, when that same questionnaire, 70% of the generals who fought the war didn't know what the objectives of the war was. And of course, at the time being a captain, you wonder, why in the world, how could this happen? But I think that Admiral Stockdale's points are exactly on target. The question of integrity, the question of beginning a war on a false premise, on a lie, really, in a sense, was almost fated to come back to haunt us. So that seemed to spread, as a matter of fact. You like to address that, Admiral?
I don't think, I'm not just looking at any one incident, but the whole history as we read this series of biographies is one of going in on the cheap and on the QT and trying not to engage the public in the discussion, either because they would give them inputs they didn't like to handle, or in some cases, I suppose, for secrecy. But generally speaking, an arrogant viewpoint of the world in which they, the intellectuals, had this under control and don't bother me and don't give me any of this howling mob routine. Now, that's what I read into it. I was not reading it very much when that was happening. Had my hands full of other things.
Tom?
Tom Carhart. I am also a twice wounded Vietnam veteran. I'm proud of my service. I was a young man. I didn't know much. We never discussed politics. I'm still quite confused. In 1965, U.S. troops landed to help stave off communism, which is South Vietnam that was falling communism. By 72, most of the country was pacified. The so-called Easter Offensive of 15 of the North Vietnamese 16 divisions invaded with 500 tanks. That attack was stopped and hurled back after several months by the South Vietnamese Army. No American troops fought, although massive U.S. air support was used. Then we signed the peace accords. We got our POWs out, including Admiral Stockdale, and we cut and ran. We gave them, I think, $3 billion in 73, $1 billion in 72, $200 million in 75. The wave of boat people followed. It seems to me that were it not for the media and the Congress, there would be millions of Cambodians and South Vietnamese citizens still alive, not under the slave of communism. There would not have been a million South Vietnamese who jumped into boats to run from their homeland, something they never did under the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, or the Americans. We've been beat up long enough, we Vietnam veterans. What doesn't kill me strengthens me. We're okay now. We don't need a parade or a slap on the back. But to the other side, as Sir Thomas More once said, in the bowels of Christ, can't you admit that you might have been wrong? Is that too much?
Well, I mean, we're willing to admit we were right and feel guilty for that if you want that. But the people who fought the war,
Would you have been at fault, or is that?
Listen, we came in with Vietnamization. We were going to support the Vietnamese. They were going to do the act. So we go in and we send 500,000 people. We lose 58,000 Americans in death and casualty. We kill millions of people. You come then in 72 and they say we're going to Vietnamize the war now, and this would be started all over again. You have no reason to believe that that would have worked if we'd given them more aid, because you'd run it for 10 years. Now you start over, and the great contribution of Melvin Laird was say we've changed the war. It was Vietnamization when it started. Now it's Vietnamizing it. And what you had was just a variation on an Orwell Latin phrase.
But U.S. troops weren't fighting by 72. It was a Vietnamese war. All they needed was money and air support.
How long would it have lasted?
Well, South Korea is still in existence.
Americans weren't fighting in 65.
I think the sad reality of it is that by 1967, the American public turns against the war. It turns, before Tet, it really turns at Tet. By the time period we're talking about, whatever we think of what the Congress did, and there's a lot of criticism of the Congress, I don't think anybody can make the statement that Congress wasn't accurately reflecting the mood of the American people. That is, the support had been lost in the people at large, and it had been lost 5 years earlier. So that I think the Congress at that time was accurately reflecting what the American people believed, who had just given up on the war, had had enough. And part of it, I must say in my own respect, was that we in the military had not given them a set of clear objectives and a realization that it could be accomplished. Ambassador Kirkpatrick, please.
Isn't it, wait, but isn't it true that as late as 1972, more public opinion polls showed repeatedly that more Americans, in fact, supported a stronger policy in Vietnam than opposed it?
Well, I think
And I think that remained true through the 72 elections.
yes, well, of course, the 72.
So I really don't think it's accurate to say that the public support for the war was lost in 1967. I remember very vividly those polls through 1968, 70, and 72, and those elections. And what there was divided public opinion with a great deal of intensity on the anti-war side and quite a lot of intensity on the other side, and then a kind of capitulation, it seems to me. But I don't think it's accurate to say that the Congress was expressing in 1975 a mood that had been present in the American public since 1967. I just don't think it's accurate.
As members of the Congress, the standard question that was used to track public opinion was it a mistake for the U.S. to go into Vietnam? The one that John Mueller uses at Rochester, and that...
Well, wait, that's
yes.
only one question
Yes.
that's used, because, there are other standard questions that were used, too, on Vietnam policy, and one was, whether we thought we ought to be pursuing, whether we ought to be prosecuting the war with greater energy, and whether we ought to be doing more, whether we ought to be doing less. That's one of the lines of questioning that was pursued by Gallup and by Michigan from about 1965 onward. And that showed, certainly through the 68, 70, 72 elections, somewhat larger numbers in favor of doing more, than in favor of doing less.
Well, Senator McGovern, you'd like to
just speaking for myself here, I recognize the importance of having public opinion behind a war effort. I don't think you can really prevail without it. But also there comes a point where a public figure has to stand on conscience. I don't think that the people who took us into Vietnam were immoral. I used to think that, but in looking back on it, I've come to the view that Thackeray had a better description of it. They were doing the mischief that the very virtuous do. Their intentions were good, just as this man who spoke about his patriotism and his pride in being there. Those aren't really the questions. The question is, was it in the national interest for us to make an even greater sacrifice than we made in Vietnam in order to prevail out there militarily? I listen to all these optimistic assessments now about how we had won the war. That isn't the way it appeared to those of us in the Congress at the time. And the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Clifford, said he couldn't see any way that we could resolve that conflict militarily on terms that were acceptable to the United States without costs that went far beyond anything we could hope to achieve by it. The fact is that the other side, and I thought we had learned this lesson in Vietnam, they don't have to win. All they have to do is survive. And they had a lot of survivors there that were willing to stay out in the jungles and to keep up the sabotage, to keep up the guerrilla tactics. I think if we had tried to resolve this militarily, we'd still be there.
Part of it's a lack of communication. I went back to Vietnam in '74, having been there in '66, '67, and the point was well made. The guerrilla war was over. The threat in 1974-75 was the North Vietnamese regulars. You could drive anywhere in Vietnam, but I think that a lot of attitudes fixed in about the early 60s, and in fact are still fixed in a great many people. They just haven't gone back and re-looked at the changing dimensions of the war. And some of it's a failure in communication. And General Murray, who was the defense attaché there, knows that by the time we left, the guerrilla war, by and large, was not the main effort. The main effort was the North Vietnamese regulars, who had in order to get the peace agreement, we had agreed to that would remain in the South. That you had,
No, I just was going to say that too.
To bring us slightly current, Ambassador Kirkpatrick eloquently warned about this tendency to confuse power with force. I wonder if there isn't a greater danger, as we've got a decade of Vietnam behind us, that the distinction is made, that there is a remarkable reluctance of this nation, its institutions, and its people to invoke either, such as in Nicaragua. Is that a danger?
just 1 second. Can everyone in the audience hear the questions? The question was really, is there a danger about confusing power with force? Is that?
And not using either.
And consequently not using either. Ambassador Kirkpatrick.
Well, I think so. You know, I think that the Vietnam syndrome involves a kind of fear of the use of American power in the world. First, it began with a kind of assumption that America was probably morally unworthy of exercising influence in the world and couldn't be trusted with power. That has tended to sort of diminish or disappear, and what we've been left with instead is simply a very powerful, I think, fear of the use of American power. Now, in an ideal world in which other countries were willing not to use power in the world too, that would be a feasible alternative. In the contemporary world, where the Soviet empire, and it is an empire, seeks to expand by bringing the resources of the whole empire to bear on targeted nations, then if we are not willing to use American power to help those nations support their own independence, I think we are creating a situation in which our reluctance to use power may lead to a situation in which we will have to use force to defend ourselves. And that is, I think, very dangerous, and I think one can see precisely those kinds of dangers today in the liberal Democrats' reflex on Central America and Nicaragua, quite specifically.
You know, this distinction between power and force is critical, and I guess the best distinction I've ever seen drawn was in John Patton Davies' book, Dragon by the Tail, where he said when the Japanese swept through Shanghai in the 1930s and overran Shanghai, the one thing they didn't overrun was the French settlement. And the French settlement was guarded by a French corporal and a squad, ironically, of Tonkinese infantry. But what kept the Japanese Imperial Army out of the French settlement was not this French squad, it was the reputation of the French army at that time, had the reputation of being the most powerful army in the world, and Japan just didn't want to didn't tangle with it. But the point was made that what they could defend with a squad, then they couldn't have defended with 2 or 3 corps at a later period. So the distinction between force and power is a very critical one.
I'm sorry.
Please.
I was impressed with Ambassador Kirkpatrick's comment at the outset that most people recognize that our military involvement in Vietnam was a mistake. And I think that is the view of most Americans these days. So it seems to me that the question that now confronts us in Nicaragua, it's too late for Vietnam, is not so much whether you use power or force, but whether you have a sufficiently compelling case to use either one. The presumption is if you invest American power or force on the side of the kind of conflict that's now going on in Nicaragua, that one side has a very clear case that's in the American interest, and that the other side is diabolically opposed to us, and that our national interest is on the line. I don't think that's true in Nicaragua. We can have differences of opinion about this, but in my judgment, that contra force does not represent a more hopeful development in Nicaragua than the Sandinista governments. I don't like either one of them all that well, but I think that if you go back to the old Somoza gang that ruled that country for 40 years, probably the Sandinista government represents a modest improvement. Well, I think why we assume it's in the American national interest or in the interest of freedom or any other lofty value for us to invest in this guerrilla force in Nicaragua against the government that we now recognize there is beyond my comprehension.
I think that one of the as I tried to say in the introductory remarks, one of the healthy things for having you and Senator McCarthy on the panel is that you understood where the challenge was to be made, and the challenge was to be made among the American people and the electoral process, and that's the correct way to make the challenge. It seems to me the healthy sign post-Vietnam is that is precisely where the challenge is being made today. The president has been working rather hard for several years now to build a public consensus for what he's trying to do in Central America, and he's put it in the hands of the American people, and it seems to me that's precisely where it belongs.
Colonel Glavius, on the patriotism, none of us ever questioned the patriotism of the soldiers in Vietnam. In fact, I made statements saying that they probably were the purest patriots because they were going into a cause really to serve the country in an undefined cause. They were not. They should have known they were not going to be heroes. This was not. We're not going to be a great welcome home, and there wasn't. They were like the Roman who said, "We're doing it for the country, for what we believe in. We're not going to have any honor. We're going to do it anyway. It's a questionable cause. We go." Different from World War II, World War I. And it was a curious thing, this is an aside which bears on this, in '68 I was in Indiana and there was a man who was standing in for President Johnson for the war, and I had observed that Kilroy didn't go to Vietnam. That meant something. You say, why wasn't he there? Never saw the name. But he said, you know, this is a strange war. He says, the first one we've had that hasn't been a happy one, which was maybe a bad word, but what he was saying was there's no joy in it. There's no one taking satisfaction from it. This is particularly true of the soldiers. And he knew it, the governor of Indiana, and everyone did. But the men who were there were pure commitments, were pure committed patriots, better than any other war we've had.
You know, this is kind of the obvious. This political action that we admire in America is I don't think it comes as news, is very avidly followed by our enemies. And they would be foolish to give up when eventual victory is theirs. They know that we don't have the staying power. Are we going to limit ourselves to only major wars that entail our national sovereignty? I mean, that's about the only thing that I can see that we could actually predictably get away with nowadays.
Well, I think we've just seen reaffirmation that de Tocqueville was right, that it is difficult for a democracy to conduct foreign policy. Let me take Admiral Moore's questions, then we have some questions over here to the right.
Well, first I'd say that I'm very pleased to hear note that General Murray in his criticism of the military people didn't include the admirals. But I also would like to say to Senator McCarthy that you can't get too much sympathy from me over your contact with McNamara because you only encountered him at a hearing and I had to deal with him every day. That being the case, I'd like to ask you, both of you gentlemen who have, of course, had the honor of representing your party in the political election, this question: how, assuming you'd been elected, how would you ensure that you didn't have a McNamara in your cabinet? And secondly, what would you do if the military commanders, in your capacity as commander-in-chief, what would you do if they refused to carry out your orders?
Did everyone hear the question? Senator McCarthy?
Well, I said in '68, kind of paraphrasing Eisenhower, I said if elected I would go to the Pentagon. And if they won't let me in, I think I'll try to get diplomatic representation. And I think that's was one part of the problem. I don't know exactly.
Can you answer my question?
Yeah, well, I have in effect. It's very difficult.
Well, that wouldn't have solved the problem for you to come back. Are you welcome anytime?
No, it would have helped, I think, what I would have done at the Pentagon. But it's a serious problem, as you said. How do you? They don't tell you the truth. How do you get into it?
The problem is the Pentagon is many. You know, I hear that phrase used all the time, the Pentagon. And no one to this day has ever explained to me what is the Pentagon.
Well, de Tocqueville said you have a military establishment that is bigger than what you need in a democracy for any particular immediate occasion. It becomes a republic within the republic.
But it's controlled by people appointed by the President of the United States.
But after they go through those portals, something happens.
I think they let it.
Admiral, I don't think either Senator McCarthy or I have ever put the blame for the Vietnam War on the Pentagon. I haven't. I don't think Senator McCarthy has. I've always thought it was essentially the civilian policy makers that charted our course out there. And as you know, when it was first proposed to President Eisenhower that we go in militarily at the time the French were about to go down, he set up 3 criteria before he would even consider that. One was that the French had to clearly request it, which they did. Secondly, that the British had to go in with us, and which they wouldn't do. And thirdly, that the leadership of Congress had to approve it, which they wouldn't do. And partly on that basis, as well as the opposition of General Ridgway and others, we didn't go in 54. But I've never thought Vietnam was essentially a military failure. I think it was a failure of American policy, and I hope that was the thrust of my remarks here today. I don't think the American interest was sufficiently involved there to justify the sacrifice that it would have taken to resolve it militarily. There's no doubt at all, never has been any doubt in my mind that we could have whipped Vietnam militarily. It's ridiculous to assume otherwise, that we couldn't defeat a little country like Vietnam. We could have done it militarily. But the question is, were the gains from that kind of victory commensurate with the enormous sacrifices that it would take? I don't think they were. I think we should have stayed out of that conflict. As Ken Galbraith once put it, if we had done that, Vietnam would have continued to enjoy the obscurity that it so richly deserves.
But George, as to the Pentagon, I think that what one might have found out was what were the contingency plans, because it presented to us that it could all be done with 150,000 men. There was supposed to be a Pentagon agreement on that. Progressives said, no, we need more, and in Westmoreland said we need 200.
The contingency plans were never carried out.
Well,
as Ambassador Kirkpatrick said, you know, we always follow any treaty we make. It was the Geneva Accords that forced us to completely abandon the contingency plans, which was made on the basis of military situation. So we didn't carry out the contingency plan.
Well, what I'm saying is the civilians responsible ought to know what the contingency plans are and whether generals and admirals support them or not, if you're going to make a political decision that's dependent on the contingency plan. What happened is, as we escalated the war, more men, bombing, all the rest of it, they kept expanding the purpose of the war. When we went in, it was supposed to be a kind of a civil war in the South. Then it was invasion from the North. Eventually, Russ was talking about 1 billion Chinese in the year 2000, that the Chinese were coming. And finally, they said, you know, the future of the free world is at stake. And once you set that as the objective, why, if we had believed it, why, you should have had a military plan to, you know, to save the free world.
I just would like to say that I thought Senator McCarthy's point earlier on was very accurate when he said that there was general responsibility, as it were, for the war, and above all in the political class and in our political system. You know, for example, President Kennedy's decision to send the 10,000, 12,000 American advisors to Vietnam was taken quite casually, I judge. And so was the congressional assent offered quite casually. I believe and tried to say that I think we moved into Vietnam with very ill-defined as well as ambiguous goals on the tides that swept us out of World War II into the United Nations, the expectation that the world was going to be peaceful, and that if it wasn't, that any deviation from peace was temporary and could be set right rather easily. Could be set right rather easily by peacekeeping operation. This is originally was going to be through the United Nations. Eventually, well, all right, if they weren't there, then we were going to do it. All those assumptions are simply wrong. I would
I'm sorry,
like to say
Jeane,
only
but due
that,
to television time constraints, I'm very sorry to have to interrupt you with all due respect. I think we've forgotten one thing in this discussion, and that is what Thomas Borge, the strongman of Nicaragua, had to say in a famous interview in September of '83 when he was asked derisively about Mr. Reagan's domino theory that Nicaragua was the first domino, and if we didn't watch out, then it would be El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and eventually Mexico. And the interviewer clearly thought that Mr. Borge would laugh this one out of court. Instead, he replied, "That is one historical prophecy of Ronald Reagan that is absolutely true." Among the several hundred letters that I received upon my appointment at the Washington Times were 2 letters from Senators Kennedy and Cranston, warm, generous in their comments. And in my reply, I said that my fondest wish was to try to contribute by consolidating this strong alternative voice in the world's most important capital, to try to contribute to a restoration of a bipartisan foreign policy. I don't think anything is more urgent, and I believe that this forum was a step in the right direction. And I thank the panelists on behalf of the Washington Times for their invaluable contribution. Thank you. Something to remember.
You know, I was talking to C-SPAN, I said, Senator McGovern is elected president, orders the Army to get out of Vietnam. What will the Army do? And the answer was, well, the Army will get out of it.
I've got to make the transcript. May I look through these spellings of names, please?
What is the beginning?
The beginning and just some authors. Do you need these? Can I return them with the transcript tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Who should I ask questions of? I hate to interrupt. The author's name, Ambassador Kirkpatrick.
Urquhart.
How do you spell?
It's U-R, I think Q-H. You have to check it in the full story.
Oh, is that okay? Thank you.
Where's? You know Alexandra, right? Westbrook.
And he kept saying,
I've got to tell you what
Those belong to...
this point that Admiral Stockdale brought out about history being...
Harry, I think these are yours.